this morning. In the room with me, I have Andy Allen, Paul Frew, Vice Chair Kelly Armstrong and Mark Durkin. And on Starleaf, I have Aisling Riley. All very welcome to the meeting this morning. Can I take apologies then, first and foremost? Any apologies anybody has?
Chair Stephen Dunn.
Oh, Stephen Dunn. Apologies from Stephen. Okay, before I move on to agenda item 2, Andy, you just wanted to bring something up before we move on?
Yeah, Chair, I just wanted to quickly bring it up about the $5 million that was allocated in the budget for charities and social enterprise to see if we get an update on that. Preferably, I know we're under pressure, a briefing, because there doesn't seem to be very much detail in relation to where that is, what the application process is going to be, and many of those charities need that now.
Yeah, and I assume that money needs spent by a certain time as well?
I would assume by the end of March.
Okay, and Kelly, you wanted to make a comment as well?
It was exactly the same point as Andy has made there. I've been in contact with Social Enterprise NI, and a number of social enterprises have contacted me. They're basically getting ready to close their doors because this money was promised as part of the support package for COVID. And as a result of COVID, these organisations are still unable to generate the income that they were beforehand. So I don't know why this pot of money has not been processed, and I don't want it to be put into the too difficult box that someone can't get applications out for it. So it'd be useful for the department to come back and confirm what's happening with the £5 million.
Okay, and I think we could rightly say it's a matter of urgency that
Absolutely.
we get this information, yeah? Members agreed?
Agreed.
Okay. I'm going to move on then to agenda item 2, which is draft minutes. You'll find the draft minutes of the 23rd of November 21 at page 5. Can I ask our members agreed with the minutes as drafted?
Agreed.
Thank you. Moving on then to agenda item 3, which is committee deliberations on the Private Tenancies Bill. Members, the committee will now continue. I was going to say conclude. That's wishful thinking. Now continue its deliberations on the Private Tenancies Bill. And just to remind members, this is not the clause-by-clause stage. We have the opportunity again today to continue to go through the clauses and where we left off last Thursday, and comprehensively review with the department any issues raised by stakeholders or committee members, and to ask for clarification on how the bill intends to address these concerns and any additional action that the department intends to take on the back of the evidence the committee has received. Members, just to remind us all, the aim today is to go through the bill one clause at a time, following the 4 themes in the summary of evidence table, discuss any issues or queries in respect of the clauses based on the evidence we've received, identify whether there are any further information or clarity required from our officials, decide on whether any amendments are to be considered, whether that's committee recommendation or ministerial assurance would suffice, clarify with the department if this is something the Minister would be happy to undertake, either assurance or amendment, and also then if we do propose any amendments to be as precise as possible on what we want the amendment to achieve. Members, you've been provided with papers starting at page 12, where you'll find a copy of the bill. A copy of the 2006 order is at page 52, which will be beneficial, as we know a lot of it is easier to read with the order beside it. And then the evidence summary table starting at 173. Research paper on the bill as it is at page 209, and departmental replies to committee queries so far start at page 362. And a further departmental response is in your tabled papers. Members, you've also received by email an updated deliberations table from the clerk to assist us in keeping track of our queries and where we are in each clause. So, excuse me, with us today we have David Polly, Eilish O'Neill and Karen Barr from the department, and also Claire McCanney from our own bill office is following proceedings and will be available to the committee for a closed session at the end of meeting should members wish to discuss options for amendments or instruction for drafting committee amendments. Andy, did you want to come in?
Can I just declare a quick interest, Chair, in relation to private sector landlord, please?
Absolutely.
Can I declare an interest as an owner of a private, of a rented property, sorry?
Absolutely, no problem. Thank you for that. Okay, members then, are we all in agreement that we proceed?
Agreed.
Okay. If members are content, we'll make a start and then welcome to the meeting David Polly, Eilish O'Neill and Karen Barr. So, all very welcome today. Good to see you.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Members, at last Thursday's meeting, we dealt with the first 5 clauses. So today we'll start with clause 6. David, can I ask you to give a very brief overview on clause 6, please? Or whoever that might be.
Karen, doing this one.
Guys again.
Thanks, Karen.
Okay, so clause 6 is certain offences in connection with tenancy deposits to be continuing offences. Clause 6 amends Article 5B of the 2006 order, making the offences under Article 5B3 or 6 a continuing offence as long as the tenancy deposit breach persists. There will be no time barrier on prosecuting a person who fails to comply with the set requirements.
Okay, thank you for that, Karen. Okay, members, respondents were asked if they were in favour of there being no time barrier on prosecuting a person who fails to comply with the set requirements of the amended article, and the majority replied that they were in favour. There seemed to be general support for this, as it was highlighted that tenants often do not discover any such failure to protect until they have completed their tenancy, normally a minimum of 6 months. So they are often unable to prosecute this offence. I have forgotten my glasses today, so I'm finding this a bit difficult as it has expired. There is an amendment proposal from Housing Rights that Article 5B of the 2006 order is further amended to explicitly state that deposits protected under an insurance-based scheme must be renewed as needed to ensure they remain protected for the duration of the tenancy. So, members, can I ask first of all, have you any comments you wish to make on that? I suppose especially that Housing Rights proposal of an amendment. Go ahead, Kelly.
I was just going to say, if the team can just explain, I know that that this clause 6 does amend 5B, but what Housing Rights is talking about, does that mean that the insurance scheme is time limited, or how does that work? Just from your understanding of what Housing Rights are asking, how can we fit that in?
And I can come in on that. To be honest with you, it's not an amendment that we would consider simply because it's an operational matter. So each of the schemes are given, they can run the scheme whatever way that they choose. And in one particular scheme, they would take an insurance premium from a landlord to protect the deposit. And then when it comes to the next year, they will look for a new insurance premium like you would with your house insurance. One of the other schemes only takes a one-off insurance premium, and that's supposed to cover that's supposed to cover them then the whole way through. So what Housing Rights are actually asking for is more to do with the operation of the scheme rather than, it's not in our legislation. The scheme are given the authority to run whatever way they choose.
So I think Housing Rights are pointing out that some landlords forget to keep on paying the annual premiums.
Yeah.
And therefore that means that the tenancy is not protected. Now, in our view, that's already covered by the existing legislation because that's just a failure to protect the deposit.
Yeah.
So that's already an offence. So we wouldn't need to change the legislation to make that a particular offence because it already is. Is that fair enough, Karen?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Yeah, can I ask, this might sound quite primitive, but what does clause 6 do actually? Because if you read Article 5B, I'm struggling to see why you need the new 11A. Because what it's basically saying is a person who commits an offence by failing to comply with the requirements of existing paragraph 3 and 6 continues to commit. It's as if you're just reminding us that, and if you can shed light on that, does this mean that under clause 6 of the new bill and under 5B of the old order, of the 2006 order, which is still in existence, that if you're found guilty of this, it's still then a fine not exceeding 20,000?
Yeah, Paul, if I can just explain a wee bit about it, that back in 2014, colleagues in the Department for Justice had confirmed that the 6-month statute barred rule applied to the tenancy deposit scheme. Apparently, where there's no period of limitation, is provided in legislation, then Article 19(1) of the Magistrates' Court Order applies, and that's the 6-month limit for institution of offences. So whenever, because of deposit, you don't find out to the end of the tenancy sometimes that a deposit hasn't been protected, and the councils went to take some of them to court. This was becoming a problem, so we had to then insert this to remove this time bar, the statute bar of 6 months.
Is that so? I mean, another way of explaining it maybe is that there's two types of offences. One is it happens at a point in time, and so in this case, the legislation is currently drafted is written whereby when the landlord fails to protect the deposit at the start of the tenancy, the offence is committed on that day. Yep. And then because of the statute time bar that Karen just explained, that means that really the council or the tenant has 6 months to complain to the council, and the council has 6 months to do something about it. The problem obviously is that most tenancies last longer than 6 months. So when the tenant finds out, gets to the end, finds out that there's a dispute, finds out their deposit hasn't been protected, the landlord has broken the law, it's more than 6 months after it happened, and the council can do nothing about it. So what we've done here is turned it into the second type of offence, which is a continuing offence, which is said that the offence is committed every single day that the landlord continues not to protect the deposit. So the offence therefore continues right up to the end of the tenancy, and that gets past this 6 month issue, because at the end of the deposit. So that's I know there's not much difference, but all we've done is really inserted the word continuing.
Yeah, I see that now, and both of you have explained that very, very well. And I'll just read into the record. 11A, the new 11A will state that a person continues to commit the offence throughout any period during which the failure continues. So yeah, that's a very good. Thank you very much for that, because it explains that really, really well. Thank you.
All right, members, then happy enough that we move on to clause 7. Okay. All right, over to yourselves again, clause 7.
All right, Chair, that would be me this time. And clause 7 is the restriction on rent increases. And really what this clause does is stipulates that rents can only be increased once in a 12-month period, and that's 12 months from the start of a tenancy. The landlord has to give the tenant 2 months' notice of any increase to the rent, and that by regulation there will be some exemptions from where a landlord has carried out work on the property, and the regulations will bring those exemptions forward.
Okay, thank you, Eilish. Okay, members, bear with me on this one, and yourselves, because there's quite a lot of more reading on this one, but more comment. So respondents were asked for their views on restrictions on the frequency of rent increases. There was qualified support due to concerns for potential unintended consequences of landlords increasing rents more often than they would have done, or preventing landlords making small and medium scale improvements to the properties if they can't then make even a small increase in the rent for almost a year. For example, views were expressed included the amount of a rent increase is as much of an issue for tenants as the frequency of the increase. Not sure if this clause is the best way to do this, but support the intention to include a measure within the bill to address the growing affordability issues facing low-income households. Also, it should prevent landlords taking advantage of tenants, especially with the current housing shortage. And the proposed restriction in clause 7(5)(c)(2) is reasonable, and however not the inclusion of clause 7(5)(c)(5), which gives powers to restrict a rent increase to once every 2-year period. This is likely to deter a landlord from making improvements. Respondents were also asked if there were any other comments they wished to make in respect of rent deposits and affordability. Among the comments received were that greater regulation on rent controls is needed across Northern Ireland as a whole, given the current shortage on the private rental sector's supply and the increasing numbers coming into the sector. The situation is volatile and competition is high for any property available. Also, it is a free market. Landlords should be able to manage their own businesses, and the private rented sector could shrink if over-regulation made it seem unattractive to landlords. And certainly that was a worry for us around unintended consequences, is that landlords decide to leave the private rented sector because of this is just one of the issues. So members, any comments on clause 7, restriction on rent increases, that they want to make in relation to this? Or will we just go straight to the department and see any responses to what we have to say? Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. When you were introducing the clause, you says restriction on frequency of rent increases, and I think that's probably a better title for the clause. So I don't know, can that be amended? Because that is a misnomer. It's not a restriction on rent increases, it's a restriction on how often they can be made.
That's true, it is. Yeah, it's the frequency and not the amount.
That is the title, is it not? No.
It's part, the title of a part clause.
Well, it's just a rent increases. Sorry, I'd read.
Restriction on frequency of rent
Oh,
increases.
sorry, well, I'd read it.
It's 5. That's what they've entitled 5C of the new.
Yeah. So what we're going to insert in the existing legislation is entitled frequency of rent increases, but as member pointed out, the bit in this bill just says restriction on rent increases. Colleagues, I'm fairly sure that's straightforward to fix, but we'll clarify things.
Well, yeah, that would be good.
Well, I suppose we could amend it so that it is a restriction on rent increases. That might be satisfactory again. Maybe if we could hear your thoughts on that. I know down here in the latest deliberations paper, there was a bit saying that this has been put off to maybe the second phase or second stage in the next mandate, but I was just wondering what the thoughts of the department are on that currently.
Okay, I'm happy to, Chair, is that okay? Do you want any more members' questions, or are you content that I come in at that point?
Come in at that point and then we'll move on. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, there have been constant issues raised around affordability, and the Minister has committed at looking at fair rents for all, which includes social tenants and private tenants, and has asked that some work be taken forward for the next mandate in relation to that. And you're absolutely right, and I know that comments were made by some of the stakeholders whenever they gave their evidence to the committee around the amount of the increase is every bit as important as the frequency of the increase. Most landlords don't raise their rents during the period of a tenancy, and most landlords have told us that they don't. When they get a good tenant into a property who's paying the rent, who's looking after the property, it's in the landlord's interest as well as the tenants to keep that relationship going for as long as possible. But we were aware within the department of instances where tenants were phoning us directly, where landlords, without any justification and without any proper notice, were telling them that the rent was being increased. One of the more extreme examples was where someone was told by a landlord that her rent was going up by £100 a month because he had found out from a friend of his who was a landlord that he was getting more rent for a property than he was. We are concerned that that sort of behaviour be stamped out. We do know that there were some concerns where some of the stakeholders felt that this could drive out adverse behaviours, and Scotland was quoted as an example where this was the case, and that meant landlords who wouldn't ordinarily have raised the rent would raise the rent. But I don't know, Chair, I know that you were at the Housing Rights Conference where there was some research presented from Scotland where they found that that actually hadn't been the case, and we would be very keen in the guidance that's going to be produced to say to landlords, look, this is just where you have a justification for increasing the rent. You can only do it unless you fall into one of the exempt categories.
Yeah, no, look, that's okay. And I know actually from personal experience, my daughter was a private rented for 3 years, and not once was it raised because she was a good tenant and they wanted to keep her. So I do know from friends and family in the sector that they don't ordinarily put rents up. You know, if they have a good tenant, they won't do it. Look, members, Paul, you want to come in?
Yes, the new 5C3 paragraph, I take it that's just a safety net. But can you tell me any examples at this time of when you would want to use that regulation?
You're absolutely right. It is in there just as a safety net, and I'm thinking of one of the more extreme examples would have been with the current COVID emergency. If there had been circumstances during the current pandemic where it was found necessary to restrict the amount of rents that were being increased, that's something that may have been considered. But that's just a sort of an extreme example, and it was just there to future-proof this particular part of the regulation, so that if there was a point in time when it was felt the rent increases needed to be restricted further, that power was in existence. But it wasn't something that we had contemplated would be needed anytime soon, and it is just a belt and braces approach to this.
Okay,
Can
thank you.
I just check? Is that
That's a different bit, I think.
did you? Yeah,
Oh.
you asked. I think Eilish has explained why
Yeah.
5.3.
No,
Sorry, 5C5 is there,
Yeah,
but did you not
yeah.
ask about 5C3?
Yes,
yes, yes, I did.
yes, he
Yes.
did. Yeah, and that's
Okay.
about the alterations, Eilish, you know.
Oh, apologies. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I've notes down of points that I wanted to make. Apologies for that.
So-
this was for where a landlord could carry out work to a property, and they had reason and needed to carry out work to a property, but it incurred a lot of expense, and they needed to raise the rent as a result. That would be one of the exemptions that we're looking at bringing forward in the regulations.
Yeah. So if the member looks at paragraph 4,
Yeah.
then it follows on from 3. So it says circumstances specified under paragraph 3 may include, in particular, dwelling house let under the tenancy is renovated, refurbished, altered, or extended. I think once we start to get onto the energy efficiency regulations as well, once we start to get into that,
Yes.
that would protect against that
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, no, that's okay. The first answer probably does the original question too, because it seems to be that 3, 4 and 5 are pretty contained together. They sort of, whilst they do different things, they sort of go in a package. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, no, I'm content. Thank you very much.
Okay, Kelly?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Guys, I just wondered, can you just clarify for me, I'm thinking about future-proof in this legislation. 5C1, this article applies to any private tenancy except a controlled tenancy, and then it refers to Article 4, that says then a tenancy is subject to rent control, which is referred to in this chapter as a controlled tenancy. Define for me what a controlled tenancy is.
Okay, now I have to go back to my PTO. A controlled tenancy is, we have statutory and controlled tenancies covered for under the Private Tenancies Order. There are a small and ever decreasing number of tenancies where the tenancy was in existence pre-1978, where the property was built before 1945, and the tenancy has been in place since before 1978, and there's been a succession tenancy where the rent can be controlled by the rent officer for Northern Ireland. There's around 500 of those tenancies currently on the rent register.
Is there any, I'm just thinking ahead of the next piece of legislation that's coming through from the department. If the department sets rents, you know, upper limits of rents or how much rents can be increased by, is there any possibility that they could come under controlled tenancy definition?
It's something that we would need to speak to departmental solicitors and OLC. I imagine because controlled and statutory tenancies were a very specific group of tenancies at a point in time that the 1978 rent order was introduced, that legislation we may not be able to extend that legislation, and it may need something with a much wider remit.
I think when we're looking at this, we would need to think about what we mean by, you know, there's different models in different places and how we use. As Eilish said, this one went back, I think, to possibly the First World War, if not the Second, whenever there was a feeling that landlords were, in a time of national emergency, were putting the arm in for tenants because there was a housing shortage because we weren't building any houses. And there's a lot more to it than just this rent control bit of being a statutory controlled tenancy.
Okay. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I've been asking questions to find out how many of the housing executive homes are over 40 years old. And we could probably push that out to 60 or 70 years old with some of those houses that have had continuous tenancies. Now, obviously that's housing executive, but if there is a future change to the housing executive where it becomes a social landlord or however that's going to look, I'm just wondering if that controlled tenancy that's defined in this could extend to something like them if they come under that, if they fall within private tenancies at some stage?
Well, they're always going to be social tenancies, so they're held under a completely different bit of a different type of tenancy. This relates to private tenancies.
I know, but
none of the proposals about the future of the housing executive that have ever been discussed would involve them going onto the private tenancies order. There's social tenancies, they're secure, they're long term, they're regulated, they come off the list, you know,
I'll hold you
all
to
of
that,
those
David,
things.
because we don't know what that looks like yet.
But I'm very happy for you to hold me to that.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about
There's-
is the requirement to give notice of increase at 5D 4. Why 2 months and not 3 months? We've heard it from other people that it would actually be better if people could be given 3 months notice, you know, when their rent increase is going up. And we're thinking in particular of those people who may be private rented tenants, but who are on housing benefit, and the amount of time that it takes to, you know, get changes to that done. I'm just wondering why under 5D4 we can't shift that up to 3 months.
I think at the point in time that we were dropped in this, we thought 2 months, given that there hadn't been really any requirement for any notice of an increase to be given, laid down anywhere, that 2 months seemed a reasonable thing to do. I don't think there's any reason why we couldn't look at there being 3 months notice. It's just we had gone from 0 to 2 months within this bill.
Okay,
But it's something we would be, you know, we'd be content to look at and refer back to our deliberations when we did the consultation in 2017 to see if we can find anything there.
Yeah, it's
any
just
reason why not?
I believe it was when we heard from Renters' Voice, they were indicating the longer amount that they can have, the better, because if the private rent isn't going to be covered by their housing benefit, they need to find some way of covering that money, and as much time as we can give them as possible. So if we, not less than 3 months, if the department would consider that, that would be a great help. That's me, Chair, thank you.
All right, okay. Anything further from yourselves on clause 7? We're happy we move on? Okay, everybody happy we move on?
Yep.
Okay, then we'll move on to clause 8. So these next set of clauses, clause 8, 9 and 10, are to do with property management standards. So clause 8 is fire, smoke and carbon monoxide alarms, etc. So back over to yourselves. Do you want to give us a quick overview on clause 8?
Yep, so clause 8 is intended to reduce risk or injury or death caused by fire, smoke, carbon monoxide. This clause inserts new articles 11 ADF into the 2006 order, which sets out new requirements on private landlords in relation to provision of fire, smoke, carbon monoxide detectors and duties on landlords and tenants with regard to these. It also allows the department to set minimum standards, and these may include things such as number, type and condition of appliances to be installed, and provides that a breach of one of these duties is an offence. Then it also gives the tenant it gives an obligation that the tenant has to take proper care of the detection appliances installed and make good any damage willfully or negligently done or caused to those appliances by the tenant or anybody other person lawfully on them. And the department then will bring forward the proposals and regulations. So the regulations will cover the standards that I talked about, the number, the type and the condition of the alarms.
Okay, Karen, thank you. Again, members, this is quite a long piece as well. I'm going to read out because there was much debate on this as well. So respondents were asked if this clause will meet the stated aim of reducing the risk of injury or death caused by fire, smoke and carbon monoxide. In private tenancies, the majority of respondents agreed that it would, with the Northern Ireland Fire and Rescue Service stating that installation of a fire detection and fire alarm system in premises can substantially reduce the risk of death or serious injury from fire. Respondents were also asked for their view on the department having the power to set minimum standards for the purpose of determining whether the duties of this clause have been complied with. Comments included there was welcome the clause, as some landlords can neglect their responsibilities to ensure that their rental properties have working fire, smoke and carbon monoxide alarms, especially in student premises. Also, as long as the landlord will only be responsible to repair appliances which they have provided, but if they are provided by the tenant, then the tenant should be responsible in the repairing of them. It is also necessary for the department to set minimum standards to enable tenants and councils to confirm if the standards have been met and are appropriate for the property. And would it be better if these were made clearer so tenants can check if their landlord is following the rules? There was an amendment proposal to the wording of 11B, as 11F states that a landlord is not obliged to repair a device if they don't have knowledge of the disrepair. It was highlighted that if landlords performed periodic checks, inspections of properties, they would be aware of the disrepair of items. When asked if there were any other comments on Clause 8, comments included it does not address the fundamental issues of the fitness standard and does not go far enough to improve physical standards in sector including risk of fire and escape from fire, particularly within flats, apartments falling outside the HMO regime. Also, landlords should be able to report tenants who deliberately remove or damage alarms, and also it is a resource issue for district councils. They will require support in terms of ensuring that there is sufficient guidance in place and that staff are adequately trained to regulate these new provisions, and then tenants' awareness combined with effective enforcement will help to ensure that standards and checks are met. Okay, members, this clause is a vitally important clause because we're talking about risk to life here. So any further comments other than or to elaborate on any of the comments that have been made? Any member wish to highlight anything further, or go ahead, Kelly?
It's just on that standards. My concern is that, and we'll get this with Clause 8 and Clause 9, it's the responsibility as well for the fire, smoke and carbon monoxide alarms in communal areas, where you have maybe a building where flats are and there's multiple landlords owning the flats. I know it's been said that the building owner would be responsible. I'm not sure under this legislation that a building owner that maybe, doesn't have responsibility for that. Just for clarification, I know it says 11D may well deal with this, but it's not clear enough to me about the shared halls or common areas where there's multiple landlords.
Okay.
And I think, I'm sorry, and I think sorry, I can hear myself coming back here. It's funny, we were talking about this earlier, and I think that the Department of Health, there's separate legislation which covers that covers this about shared and communal spaces. Maybe Eilish or David, if you were talking about it.
Well, the management agents, so there's different scenarios of types of buildings that have more than one property in them. Okay, so we've covered off the bit for the private landlord and the private tenancy, but they're obviously in a situation where it's a large block of flats, there'll be a management agent, and management agents have responsibilities, which, as Karen says, derive both from Department of Health legislation, but the fundamental oversight of management agents is by the Department of Finance.
Yeah.
So it's not within scope of this bill. So we've gone as far as we can, but some of the questions that were raised would relate more to the duties of management agents, or the broader general duties of under the sort of the fire type legislation, which you will hear from the tone of my voice I'm not deeply familiar with, which is the responsibility of the Department of Health.
That's where I'm a bit concerned, because management agent, not every type of home that we have with multiple landlords has a management agent. That's one thing. The other thing is, we don't want a Grenfell here where we have lots of people blaming each other for different things. So I'm a bit concerned now. We've had Department of Health and Department of Finance who are not, coming up with any, legislation or anything on that. It's maybe something that we do need to get clarification on, because as the chair says, this is about people's lives, and hopefully we won't have any fires or carbon monoxide incidents, but I just don't want to, I just feel uncomfortable with a piece of legislation coming forward where nobody knows who's responsible for,
I think we can ask those questions. I know certainly we're sitting on the Committee for Health for a number of years, and we know that public safety falls under that and the fire service fall under the Department for Health, that there will be rules and regulations there. So I think if we can, as a committee, we'll write to both Finance and Health and ask them just to clarify those, because it might be worth us putting that in our report.
Yeah.
That we sought clarification on those issues. Yeah.
I
Go ahead,
I think
sorry,
that would
David.
I think that would be really. I think you should do that, Chair. But you will all be aware that there's work going on in relation to building safety on foot of, well, basically on foot of Grenfell, and the various reviews that carried out there to make sure that, and the executive has said that people in Northern Ireland should have no less protection than people in England are going to have after all that work's done. So that mainly relates to taller buildings and fire safety within taller buildings. But there is a programme board being run by DOF, which is overseeing all of that work. So there are a few bits of it falling to DFC, but it's mainly out with that. So that will help. That will provide some clarification. But just to go back to, I suppose, the point about this bill, this bill is a private tenancies bill. It relates to the relationship between a landlord and a tenant within the flat. So those broader things don't really apply. Well, they don't apply, and any attempt to put them in this bill would put it out of scope.
Although I think it would be fair to say, David, whenever the group has been established to draft the regulations where there are gaps identified, we would be flagging them up wherever they need to be flagged, and we would be involving colleagues from other departments who have responsibility in some of these areas to see where things need to be escalated to. But you're right, it is a private tenancies bill to do with a private property.
But is
As
it not?
Ailey says, we'll need to align those things, and
Yes.
make sure everything's working together.
I just wonder, under health and safety, which I know is health and safety at work, but it also applies to people who have customers, which would be landlords, about safe access and egress. So it's not really good enough to turn around and say that a landlord isn't responsible, because they are responsible for safe access and egress. So if they don't have an appropriate responsibility for fire, smoke and carbon monoxide alarms, then if there is a terrible incident, then they're not providing safe access and egress. So I do put this back on the landlord again. If you were a business, in fact, a business is responsible for it under health and safety legislation, so the landlord is a business. But no, we'll write to Department of Finance and make sure, because I'm just concerned that this has fallen between stools here. And while there is this programme board, we don't know how long they're going to take to do this, so yeah, I'm just worried about that, because access and egress is a tool that's used in corporate manslaughter, so I don't think that we should ignore it. Yeah.
Okay, no, I think that is worth us drilling down a bit more detail on that, Paul.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about the tension between tenants and landlords, because this intrigues me. Legislation here, you're dealing with human beings. So I think it's essential that you have 11E, General Qualifications for Landlords' Duties, and also 11F, Knowledge of Disrepair. So that's my first question. Why do you need 11F, Knowledge of Disrepair, when in the 2006 order, in clause 11.2, it states a landlord is not under a duty to carry out works by virtue of Articles 7 and 9 unless he has actual knowledge, whether because of notice given by a tenant or otherwise of the need of those works. So just to reassure me, is 11F in this bill covering the new clause 11A?
Yeah, it would be. That would be the only reason, Paul, that it would be in again. It'll be covering the new bit about the actual fire alarms and smoke detectors.
Okay. And in the existing wording of 11 in the 2006, that's basically Articles 7 and 9, obviously, is what that covers.
Yeah, that's for the duties to repair that are already in the private tenancies order under 7 to 9, yeah.
Yep.
7 up to 10, right through, yeah.
Yep. So that brings me to my question then around the tension. Are you convinced that 11E does it with regards to a dispute whereby a tenant has willfully or through negligence damaged or caused damage to a device, and this goes on for weeks and months, a dispute between tenant and landlord as to who's liable? Ultimately, we all need that device fixed, but if there's a dispute between who's to blame for the damage and then who's responsible to fix, how do you see this playing out if this legislation is enacted and something horribly goes wrong?
So your question is, when we have this in place and there was something gets damaged and the landlord and tenant go into dispute over whose job it is to fix it?
Yes. Is that sufficient defence for is 11E a sufficient defence for the landlord?
So 11B starts off with the duties of the landlord, and it says that the landlord has to keep fire and smoke and carbon monoxide detectors in good repair.
Yep.
The tenant then in 11C has a duty not to willfully break them or take the batteries out or anything like that.
So no, it says that the tenant under a private tenancy must make good any damage to those appliances. So
So must take proper care and then is responsible for fixing them if they've willfully or negligently broken them.
Yeah.
So your question is if they have an argument as to whether or not the tenant has willfully or negligently broken them or if they have just failed.
Yeah, basically that's, so you can imagine that playing out in the court when something horribly goes wrong. Is 11E a sufficient defence for the landlord? Because, you know, you could have tenants who doesn't even remember damaging some bits of devices or properties and then is in dispute with the landlord. Now, ultimately you need this fixed, and ultimately I would think 9 times out of 10 the landlord will just take it in the chin and fix it. But you then could have a problem tenant whereby for whatever reason they keep damaging property, including the detectors. So I suppose I'm asking, is that a sufficient defence for the landlord in 11E?
In that instance, I'm just wondering if you have a tenancy agreement, Paul, though, and you have within your tenancy agreement about, you know, you'll say some of this, you know, that they have their duty. Surely that would be a breach if they did continually break that. You could take that under your tenancy agreement, that it was a breach of tenancy agreement. And
I think there's
Do we
two
need-
more straight.
Do we need something in there? Do we need something in there whereby there is some sort of written evidence for the landlord that he had requested the tenant, or she had requested the tenant to fix or to put on notice that they should fix the detector? And at least then the landlord, if something was to go wrong, the landlord would be able to produce that written chronological evidence that they had asked and requested of the landlord or the tenant to fix it several times.
If I answer to that, I think it would be very sensible for a landlord to put it in writing, because otherwise, if it came to a dispute, and you've said ultimately it could come to a dispute in a court if there's a tragedy and there's an investigation and things, it would very likely come to dispute with the tenancy deposit scheme.
Yeah.
Because the default position is that the landlord would be taking this money out of the deposit at the end of time, and then they would need to explain to the TDS, the tenancy deposit administrator, that was reasonable.
But I suppose it's a risk to health and safety while the tenancy is ongoing.
Yeah.
And I suppose Karen's point is right. Whenever the draft, the model tenancy agreement's being produced in a template, there will obviously be highlighting the roles and responsibilities of the tenant, and this is something that should be highlighted. And I think, Paul, to answer your question, I think the guidance would be a place to cover that. The guidance that's going to be produced for landlords saying where there is any dispute, make sure that you have a proper record of when the breakage or the damage was brought to your attention, and when you contacted the tenant to have this made good, so that the landlord has some protection. While that's far from ideal, because while the thing remains damaged, whether it's an alarm or whatever, then there is still a risk to the tenant, which the tenant is obliged to repair going by our legislation.
So you added a very good point there with regards to the tenancy deposit and the fact, well, if there is that dispute and the tenant is in danger because of a device faulty, the landlord probably would be in order to actually use some of the deposit money to actually fix the detector, even if it's not his responsibility at that point, and even if he isn't responsible for the damage.
Yes.
And that would save the safety aspect, because the device would then be fixed. But that would be in good order to do that, you would suggest.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's what. I mean, there's another side of this as well. I know we've talked so far about the health and safety of the tenant, and that's obviously really important. But from a landlord's point of view, they don't want their building going on fire either.
Yeah.
You know, there is a benefit to the landlord from having properly functioning fire and smoke detectors.
Yeah.
It also protects their asset.
Yeah.
So I think that's the scenario you sketched out would be the most likely, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, anybody else want to make a comment on this, or are we happy we move on to clause 9? Okay, we're going to then move on to clause 9, which is energy efficiency regulations. So can I get a quick overview on clause 9, please?
I'm doing this one, Chair.
No, it's electrical. It's electrical, is it not?
No.
Hold on.
Energy.
Energy.
No,
Energy.
energy efficiency.
Energy's first, yeah.
So, Clause 9 introduces Schedule 2 and notes its purpose with the provision of an enabling power to make regulations concerning the energy efficiency of dwelling houses let under private tenancy. And then I'll do Schedule 2 as well.
Yeah, that's fine.
So, Article 11G 1 and 2 set out the powers for the Department to make regulations subject to negative resolution to detail the requirements for the energy efficiency of dwelling houses let under private tenancy and what the minimum level any energy performance certificate should be. Article 11G3 provides that the Department may, by regulations subject to negative resolution, provide which particular dwelling houses that will be exempt from any prohibitions imposed by the regulations. Article 11H 1 and 2 provides that the Department may specify in regulations any offences committed by virtue of non-compliance. And an amendment to Article 72 provides that when making the regulations, the Department must consult the Department for the Economy, district councils and such persons as appear to the Department, be representative landlords and any other people the Department considers appropriate.
Okay, thank you. All right, I will then read out what our responses were. So respondents were asked for their views on clause 9, and among the comments received were it should work in tenants' favour by ensuring properties are as energy efficient as possible. They would anticipate that introduction of energy efficiency regulations and its implementation in the private rented sector would be consulted upon. It represents an important start towards tackling fuel poverty and improving energy efficiency in the private rented sector. A substantial economic package will likely be required to support private landlords' improved standards and avoid costs transferred to tenants. There is also potential for properties in the lowest thermal banding to become vacant and lead to areas of empty homes or dereliction if funding and technology are not available to make necessary improvements, and should be some checks or balances regarding capital expenditure required to meet said regulations where it is not economically viable from an investment point of view to enhance the property to the level of the regulation. Respondents were also asked if the clause and related Schedule 2 would future-proof the legislation sufficiently with regard to energy performance certificates. On this, there was a mixed response, with some feeling that it will increase rents or reduce rental housing stock, and thoughts that some EPC checks do not present a true rating. So again, members, anybody want to raise any issues here on top of that, or comments you want to make, Kelly?
I just wanted to ask, when we had it under 7.5C3, does that cover the Department may by regulation specify circumstances in which the paragraph 2 does not apply? This is to do with rent increases, and you mentioned before that would that's alterations. So if we have a landlord that has to make significant alterations in order to meet energy efficiency standards in the future, will that 7.5C3 protect the tenant from rent increases to cover that cost?
7.5C3, I think, would give us the power to make regulations that would make an exemption, which would basically it would allow a landlord to put up rents if they had just done a substantial renovation to the building. But we would, first of all, would have to decide whether or not to use that, and secondly, as part of that would be work to define what we meant by substantial. And through our pre-consultations and also in your evidence sessions, there was a bit of discussion about exactly how easy that might be. But to go back to what we were thinking, is that some of these energy efficiency improvements might be very costly.
I'm just wondering, you say that this can, the department may by regulation specify circumstances in which paragraph 2 does not apply, and you're saying that that would allow you to let landlords increase the rent for that, but what about stopping a landlord from increasing rent for that?
If we didn't want to do it, we wouldn't use that power.
Okay. Okay.
All right, members, any other comments on that? Happy enough with anything raised there? Mark, do you want to come in?
There's one wee thing, I think I might have raised it before, but sorry, I forgot my computer. So this stuff isn't readily available in front of me. I was trying to follow it on my phone with great difficulty. And that's where you have the current and common practice of private landlords availing of government schemes to improve the energy efficiency of their homes. Now, what isn't so common, but I don't know how rare it is, it certainly does occur, is where a private landlord qualifies, or the property qualifies for one of these schemes by virtue of the tenant's financial circumstance. So say they're both on qualifying benefits, the tenant's on a qualifying benefit, the landlord applies using the tenant's details, and then once the work is done, once the grant's received, the tenant's out in their ear and the house is on the market. Is there any scope to protect tenants in that sort of situation? Or if that money has been put into that property, or that investment has been put into that property, I don't know what tools there are to try and keep it within the private sector for a limited time at least.
Yep. So the affordable warmth scheme is probably what you're talking about. The affordable warmth scheme is improvements to the landlord's property on the basis of the circumstances of the tenant, because it's the person in the tenancy who is considered to be fuel poor. So if the tenant meets the qualifying criteria for the affordable warmth scheme. I suppose the first point I would make is that an issue with the affordable warmth scheme is that given the number of fuel poor tenants in the private rented sector, the take-up of that scheme by landlords is very low.
Very low.
It is, I think, about 5% of all applicants. When I'm talking to landlords, I typically encourage them to apply. Landlords pay for half of the work under the affordable warmth scheme. If you're an owner-occupier, a fuel-poor owner-occupier, you would get all of the costs covered, of the eligible costs, but the landlords pay half of them themselves. So that's the first control, is that there's a degree of balance. You're expecting landlords to pay for half of it. But I suppose my initial take on it is first, considering the number of fuel-poor tenants in the private rented sector, considering the amount they're spending on fuel, and considering the risks to their health of being in cold houses, I would want more landlords to take it up. On the affordable warmth side, there is a discussion as to whether or not we could implement some sort of clawback if a landlord was to sell a house quickly after making the improvements. If they were, putting up, this is going to sound the caricature what you're suggesting would happen. You have a relatively poor tenant and you move them between your three houses, and every time they move house you apply and you get some work done to your houses and improve it like that. I suppose the other point I would want to make is that in the context of having to get to net zero and the amount of work that we need to do to the entire housing stock, we are going to have to start subsidising a lot more energy efficiency work, and we need to find a way of doing it, of making those programs work in a way that actually attracts landlords to do work to their houses. So in this legislation, there is the stick. We're going to prohibit the renting of houses that have poor energy efficiency, but we do need to think of the other side of encouraging landlords to apply for the schemes which are actually available and which they can apply for and which they aren't. And I think the reason for that is in and around, the landlord doesn't necessarily get the benefit of it. It's possibly as simple as that, Anyway, sorry, go on.
No, I fully get and support the need to incentivise these adaptations without a doubt, but it just also, I think it's paramount that we ensure that tenants aren't being exploited in any way.
Just on what Mark is saying there, my concerns would be that when the value of the property is improved because of work that's done to make it more energy efficient, then the rent can go up. And that's where I see the tenant being, taken advantage of. It may not necessarily be to repay the cost of work, but by the simple value of the house not having mould growing up the walls and it's warm and it's not damp anymore, that's where the landlord can bump up the rent because it's a better domicile. I would be worried about that.
I think, Joe, what we will be looking at whenever we're drafting the regulations will be what has worked in other jurisdictions. And we know in Scotland, for example, the landlord could only carry out work to the property in between tenancies so that the tenant wasn't disadvantaged, and there was a sufficiently long lead-in time that meant that landlords were able to do the work over a prolonged period of time, I suppose depending on the work that will have to be done to the property. And we will be guided by this very much by colleagues in economy who are working on the energy strategy and by the sector itself as we're drafting the regulations.
So does that mean then if a tenant is sitting and in need of something substantial done to the house, it can't be done until there's a break in tenancy?
No, I'm just saying that's what they did in Scotland, and it was to give a lead-in time, and it's something that we would be looking at how that worked and what actually that looked like in practice. There are current fitness standards that have to be adhered to, and I know I probably opened up a can of worms by mentioning the fitness standard and the fact that we are going to look at it in the next stage, but there are current fitness standards that must be met in order for a tenant to stay in a property, and the council have powers to make a landlord carry out works to a property where those works need to be done at the minute under current legislation.
I can't wait to see those fitness standards coming through and for the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, never mind the private rental sector. That's another story.
Take you to a few premises actually up University Road at the minute where the mould is growing on the walls for the students.
Yeah.
Anything further members want to comment on energy efficiency regulations, or anything further that the department want to comment on some of the other comments that were maybe made?
There is quite a lot in this. This is going to be quite an exciting area, and we're going to, so the point, just to establish the point that we will consult on this, we will do it, we'll consult on it before we do the regulations. We will do it in line with the energy strategy. One of the landlord representatives made the point that, if we make them go too fast, then the entire grid will fall over and we won't be able to light our houses, never mind heat them. We aren't going to do that. This is going to be done in line with the energy strategy. So if we're shifting electrification to heat, we'll do that in line with that. We are aware, as Ailey said, that this could be quite intrusive for tenants and possibly expensive for some landlords. So we're going to do it over a period of time. Really the time frame here is out to 2050. So there's two parts to it. There's the fuel poverty bit, and then there's where our housing stock needs to be in order to deliver net zero by 2050, which is 30 years away. So this is going to be done carefully and with lots of consultation, and not rushed. And we need to get this right. This is, I would say, one of the most important parts of this bill.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And if members are agreeable, come on to the electrical safety standards. Members happy enough? We move on to clause 10. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Then, can I ask you to give us a brief overview in clause 10, please?
Okay, Chair, that would be me. And clause 10 introduces Schedule 3 and notes its purpose with the provision of an enabling power for the department to make regulations concerning electrical safety standards in private tenancies.
Okay, thank you, Eilish. Okay, so respondents were asked to give their views on this clause, and among the issues highlighted were the need for a time period for checks, such as every 5 years, as in Scotland, or whether or not it should include fixed wiring checks, electrical installation condition report, which EICR, at least every 5 years. In addition to portable appliance tests, the PAT testing, comments included that it should work in tenants' favour by ensuring properties are as safe as possible and also by maintaining the overall standard of the property. Would welcome mandatory electrical testing similar to that in Scotland. which includes fixed wiring checks, electrical installation condition reports at least every 5 years in relation to PAT testing. Welcome this clause and see electrical safety is another area where basic safety requirements are long overdue, and welcome this clause and a long campaign for this within the PRS. Will welcome in line with the PRS in England and Scotland, and regular checks of equipment are already held in HMOs in Northern Ireland. So I'll open up for members. I assume, Paul Frew, you want to come in? Yeah,
Yes, I'll declare an interest as an approved electrician. So Schedule 3, it's a no-brainer. I think we do need to bring some sort of regulation into electrical testing and standards. I would have a dispute around 5 years. Might be a wee bit excessive, but I think that you should have it connected to the actual registration of landlords, because I just think that's a natural thing, and I think that's every 3 years, is it? So 3 years is most definitely too short a period of time. So probably 6 years is probably where I would sit. 9 years. But probably 6 is closer to your own position. But what strikes me when I look at the schedule is that, and again, I know you're only, clause 10 itself, is only an enabling clause, but Schedule 3 is what you're basing it on. You have the EICR test, which is fine, the electrical installation and the wiring. And you do have electrical fixtures, fittings and appliances provided by the landlord. Which is fair enough too, because tumble dryers, washing machines do go on fire. But it strikes me that there's a glaring omission here, in that a good lot of the fires contained in domestic properties will be caused by faulty phone chargers, hot hair straighteners and faulty hair dryers and everything else that can easily be carried about and heats up. And that's missed. Now, I know that's a burden on the tenant. But surely we need some sort of regulation for that. I'm saying that when we don't have for private homes. But neither do we have EICR tests regulated for private homes. So I suppose what I'm putting to you is, are we missing a trick here with regards to items and equipment, portable equipment that actually goes on fire?
Okay, can I attempt, I feel totally out of my depth in speaking to a qualified electrician in relation to this. I appreciate your views around the...
Don't fear so much, I'm out of the game for 12 years.
Oh, you're still an expert.
It's all right. Every member has a list of things they need done in their house.
Oh, May.
Your view on the frequency of the checks is really much appreciated, because it did, during the consultation, cause some debate, because some of the landlords were really not happy that we were looking at introducing these, and the frequency of the not that they didn't want the checks carried out, but the frequency of them was giving rise to some concern among them, because they felt as homeowners aren't required to carry out these electrical safety checks, then they didn't want too much of a burden to be placed on them. The link to the registration, I think, is a very good point, and certainly something that we look at as we move in to the regulations. And you're right, when it comes to Schedule 3, this is placing the burden on the landlord to make sure that the property they own is protected. And we didn't include the PAT testing, I think, for exactly the reason that you articulated there, in that as a homeowner, no one comes into my home to check some of the personal items that I own here, and hair dryers and things, to check that they're safe. And that's why it wasn't included. This was to put a burden on the landlord to make sure that the property that they were letting out was safe for the tenant to live in. But when it comes down to where a fire starts, is that a sort of an academic point?
Oh, okay. So I get why you need the regulation, and I get that there's an exchange and a tension between the person who owns the property and the person who lives in the property. But given that exchange and given that tension, and given the causations of fires, I worry about missing that. Now, again, I worry about the burden being placed on a tenant. But it just strikes me as as an omission from,
So
yeah, go
if
ahead.
we were to include something, then there would be two ways of doing it. One would be to put a duty on the tenant, which would basically say before they were allowed to rent the house, they would have to pay somebody to electrically test all of their electrical appliances, and they would be somehow in breach of their contract if they got a new phone and plugged it in before they got somebody to test the plug. So I mean, you see where I'm going here. It might be quite onerous and the other thing would be to put a duty on the landlord that it's their responsibility to test all of the portable appliances and phone chargers and things like that, which would be equally
Burdensome on a landlord.
burdensome and I think unfair on a landlord to keep up with the day-to-day business of their tenant. And you're not really meant to keep up with the day-to-day business of your tenant. The whole point of a tenancy is that it's their house and they get on with stuff.
Yeah, I get that, and that's why I'm
By way of
struggling.
saying, not that your point isn't important, it's just hard to know what we would do.
Yeah.
I
get that, and that's why I'm struggling, and that's why I haven't committed to any sort of amendment. I haven't. But it just strikes me, the rationale is there to do EICR, the installation. But you're also placing a burden on electrical fixtures, fittings and appliances. Now, I know that's white goods. But it could also, well, it probably won't range to kettles and toasters, because not unless it's a holiday let. But you can see the glaring omission here and the causations of fires where we haven't covered it in legislation or regulation. And I'm teasing it out with you, but I'm not. I haven't settled on any particular point of view. But it was interesting to hear your views, and I get the points you make. I really do.
And can I just add something else? The electrical safety checks will be carried out periodically. So say they were every 6 years, so that with landlord registration, the second time that you registered, then you would have to have these checks carried out. The average tenancy in Northern Ireland, the Tenants Deposit Scheme administrators tell us, lasts for a year to 18 months. They're extending now, I think, due to supply issues. But then you would have maybe 2 or 3 tenants in a tenancy during the period of a periodic tenancy who wouldn't have any checks carried out on any personal items that they own. It would just be a check that would be carried out at a point on time on a particular tenant. So you could have a tenant who moves from tenancy to tenancy who would never have a check carried out on their phone charger or their hair straighteners, whereas you could have somebody else who could have a check carried out. So I don't know that it would prove a lot at a point in time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I get that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Kelly, you wanted to come in?
I was just going to ask on this point then, where under, now I know we're talking about clause 10, but if we go back to clause 1, 124A, tenant to be given notice regarding certain matters, grant of tenancy. If there is a prescribed form that's used, of words, that's used for that tenancy agreement, I'm expecting that there would be something in there that requires tenants to only use, electrical equipment that's in good working order, and it says to the tenant at that point it's their responsibility to ensure that it remains in good working order and they don't overburden plugs or use anything where wires are exposed or anything like that. Is that part of that? I'm just thinking about, will there be a template provided by the department? Yeah, that would include
so
that.
we talked about a model tenancy agreement, didn't we?
Yes.
And that could include something like that.
Yeah. So that may be
And
one
that's
thing.
a really good, that's a really good point. And and I'll be honest with you, not something I had thought of, but that is exactly where you would put something of that nature, that there is a burden of responsibility on tenants to make sure that they're using stuff that's safe.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Look, can I just ask members at this point, is anybody due in the chamber at 10:30? I know there's a ministerial, there's agriculture and infrastructure both on before. So it's just to ask that, or are you all right to stay with us for a little while longer? We might just get this done, wrapped up, yeah? Okay, and can I also just say that Anya Murphy joined the meeting quite early on after it was started, and an apology was received from Ciara Ferguson, just to update for the record. Okay, members, are we happy we move on to clause 11? Yes? Okay. All right then, clause 11, can you give us just a quick overview on that?
Yeah. Clause 11 introduces a number of amendments to Article 14 of the Private Tenancies Order 2006, as well as inserting a new Article 14A. It'll provide extra protection to tenants and extend the mandatory notice to quit period for landlords to provide to tenants to 8 weeks after the first 12 months and until the tenancy is 10 years old. The notice to quit for tenancies longer than 10 years remains unchanged at 12 weeks. What do I say? It includes a provision to alter the notice to quit periods by way of regulations and apply specific exemptions if the relevant period is extended, which is subject to the draft affirmative procedure, and imposes a duty that the department must consult on any new provisions with landlord tenant representatives and appropriate bodies before laying any drafts before the Assembly.
All right, Karen, thank you. Okay, members, this again is one that might have a bit of discussion around it because there was a lot of responses to this, so bear with me. So respondents were asked for their views on Clause 11, and the views expressed varied depending on whether it was a landlord or a tenant perspective. Among the comments received were that they welcomed the standardisation of such notices and the amendment of minimum notice periods for tenants to provide to landlords. Concern was raised as to how it will be enforced, and also there should be a requirement on a tenant to give similar notice or be held financially responsible, and also that it welcomed but would welcome additional proposals relating to grounds for eviction similar to other jurisdictions to reduce the number of evictions. Respondents were also asked for their views on a range of time periods regarding notices to quit depending on how long the tenant has been in the house. Among the comments were Renters' Voice is adamant that the clause does not go far enough to increase security for private rented households. Significant value in continuing with the 12-week notice to quit required by landlords under Section 1 of the Private Tenancies Coronavirus Modifications Act Northern Ireland 2020. Also, notice to quit period should be 12 weeks instead of 8 weeks, currently provided in Clause 11.4. And then for those under a year, it may be appropriate to consider a notice period which is longer than 4 weeks but less than the period required for tenancies which are longer than 12 months. There should be a different range of time periods for families as opposed to single people and couples. And where there are arrears or antisocial behaviour damage, it should only be 1 month's notice. Quick eviction is required, and then HMOs should be excluded from the extended NTQ proposals, as that segment of the market is categorised by shorter term lets. Respondents were also asked for their views on this clause, giving the department the power to alter notice to quit periods in some tenancies. Some of the comments included it needed to be made clear in what circumstances this would or would not apply. Concerns about the exemptions for landlords retaking their property for sale or for personal or family occupation. The proposal is acceptable if tenants in rental arrears were excluded from the extended notice to quit period, and the department should not be interfering in a private contract agreement between a landlord and a tenant. So, yeah, lots of comment around this, and again, I know it was something that was raised at the Housing Rights Conference as well. And I think there's a good point there when it comes to families who will be harder to find somewhere else, especially when we look at schools and everything else, that they would have to change. So that 4-week notice to quit certainly wouldn't help them out in any way. So just members, I'm going to open up to members first if they have anything further they want to add to this or reinforce any comments that have been made. Or we can just go directly then to the department. If you could just maybe answer some of those, or look at those queries that have been raised here, and give us any answers you think we need to hear.
Shall I start at the beginning then?
Yes, please.
We're going to launch a consultation on notices to quit, either today or tomorrow, and the minister will be writing to the committee about that. But we thought we would tell you now, and that is around the lengths of time given everything that has changed since the department originally consulted on this. given the entirely changed context in and around the private rented sector, given that we have now moved to 12 weeks for 2 years. The Minister has been clear that she doesn't think 8 weeks is sufficient length of time for notice to quit, and has asked us to consult on it. So we've carried out some research over the summer, and we're going to start a short, sharp, very focused consultation on notices to quit, and that should inform the passage of the bill as it goes through the Assembly. It'll, I hope, help the committee and the members on this, and then on that, and just the last point to make on that is, you will all know that in this is a clause that allows the Minister to amend the notice to quit up to 6 months with considered exemptions without coming back and doing new primary legislation. So from our point of view, and you've summarised very briefly the considerable number of comments that were made in and around this area, which are largely that there is a feeling that 8 weeks is still short from a lot of people, but that if you go longer than that, that it is important to take into account exemptions to consider different circumstances. So that.
Okay, look, I mean, that is very welcome news that you are going out to consult on this, absolutely, because certainly that is the evidence during our consultation that we've received. I don't know how that is going to help us as we try to get this finalised, because that would make this difficult for us on that clause specifically, whenever we're trying to then do when we get to the clause by clause consideration. So what's your time frame on that? Have you got it? When's that close, and when will we get the results?
It'll be an 8-week consultation, and it's going to start as soon as possible. If not today, it'll be tomorrow. The difficulty with these things is more the difficulty of getting them online in an accessible and appropriate format, rather than the actual content of them, if you follow, which would put us towards the end of January.
End of January, yeah.
It really is a very short and focused consultation. Can't emphasise that enough.
That's beyond our committee stage.
Yeah, that goes, so it's going beyond our committee stage.
What was that, sorry?
Will that go beyond our committee stage then?
Yeah.
I think so, yes.
Okay, right, well that makes things just a little bit awkward. Kelly and then Paul.
I was going to say then, if the department has taken that forward, I would be proposing then the department come back with a new wording on that clause to basically say that everybody, until such times as that's amended, that everybody gets a 3 or 6 months notice period, because we can't really go forward with any of these in the clause without that consultation then, because it could throw up something completely different. It'd be outside of our scope as committee to deal with that. So in the meantime, other than remove that clause, it's keep it in with a very basic suck it and see. wait until the consultation's over.
Okay,
Be dealt with
Paul,
it.
did you want to?
Yeah, so first of all, it's good that you have agile government. It's good that you're listening with regards to consultation. It's good that you've realised that there's issues here with the clause of an intended bill. That's all very good and refreshing, might I add. But because of the consultation being 8 weeks, it raises all sorts of questions. This committee will do its work and it will pass it on to the Assembly, as it should always do. I think we need real good clarification from the Minister at consideration stage as to the intent and the rationale around the consultation. A question I have for you on this is this. How does the consultation tie in with any regulation? Well, suppose you would need royal assent of this bill first for them to have regulation. So there's a chicken and egg scenario there where this gets passed and then you regulate changes. But then I ask the question, what is it you're actually going to pass? And it goes to Kelly's point, Deputy Chair, as to the actual definitions around time.
Yeah, so I suppose in all of this, we're all victims of the fact we're coming up against the mandate, and we're trying to cram quite a lot of work in to a shortened assembly term, and also everyone's lost time because of coronavirus. We'll have to be realistic about that too. So it's not a position, I know it's not a position the committee wants to be in. It's not, I mean, this is, as you say, fairly unusual for us as well, because what we would normally do is sort of slow the whole thing down and wait until things can be done in a correct order and things like that. I mean, our proposal then is the bill as drafted does extend the notice to quit for people. I keep on saying 8 weeks, but obviously that's just from,
Yeah.
from after 12 months to 10 years. After
Yes.
10 years, it's going to stay at 12 weeks, under 12 months. So the bill as drafted does improve the protections for tenants, and it includes a clause to allow this to be looked at, as you say. So that regulation power could only be used after the bill becomes an act, and that won't happen when the Assembly passes it. There will be a period of time whilst it goes through the processes to get royal assent.
Yeah.
So that power will become available to a minister, depending when the bill is passed and depending when royal assent is given. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, could I just add that at the moment the coronavirus emergency regulations have been extended until May 2022. So up until that point in time, all landlords are still required to give 12 weeks notice to quit to their private tenants.
Yeah.
I suppose that gives some sort of comfort, so it does, yeah, but I mean, I suppose it's just not ideal, for any
No,
of us
it's not.
that this is the position that we're in. But I would say the committee will have a little bit of discussion on this in closed session as well, as to what we would like to see then that the minister put in, and what we then put into our report as well. Around that, Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, just off this, but still on the clause. Are you minded to do anything around students with the tenancies of less than 12 months?
Yeah.
And if I can just say, there is a question in the consultation around that and asking for views on what people consider, if they consider 4 weeks, which is the normal and is in there now, sufficient for under 12-month tenancies. There is a question in the consultation.
So
At the minute, we were keeping it as it was. It was 4 weeks for anything under 12 months.
4 weeks. So you're not minded to amend this existing clause in this existing bill? You're going to wait to the consultation on that question?
We weren't minded to change it. But not specifically on students and tenancies less than 12 months. No. It's a wider question, Paul. I suppose for the information that we would have would be that for students on the North Coast, their tenancy is for a shorter period of time, because the landlord then has the summer months in which they're able to rent out the property. But for the broader student body, and my personal experience of being a parent of students over the years has been they sign a 12-month contract, when maybe a shorter contract period would actually suit them better. But the landlords in areas where they don't rent the properties out over the summer are more content with a 12-month contract period for those student tenancies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose this does make an important point. I know that there were some comments about having a different set of rules for students. Now, I haven't seen those fully articulated yet, but I know NUSUSI is running a campaign. But from our point of view, I mean, it would be very difficult to start changing the rules depending on the educational status of a tenant and what that happens to be, if you start to think it through. So I suppose the department's point is that we want to improve the protections for tenants no matter what they do, and no matter who they are.
I think the issue for the students, but is that there is no get-out clause in their contracts. They either pay the whole 12 months, and doesn't matter how much notice they give, they're still being hit for the full length of time. So say, for instance, somebody starts uni September, October time, and it's not for them, and they leave by November, they still have to fit the bill for a full 12-month rent. So the notice to quit is just irrelevant for them. It's that type of thing that we'd love to see the end of, and we saw how effective that was whenever the university accommodation enabled people to break out of their contracts early during COVID. So
Yeah, and there is sorry, go on ahead.
Well, I was going to say that in almost all cases like that, the tenant has signed a contract for 12 months. So the under 12 month part of this bill will only apply to places where there isn't a written contract, or there is a shorter tenancy which is turned into a periodic one. So in almost all instances, those students have essentially received, they've agreed a 12-month contract, and that says the tenancy will end on that time. So they've essentially received 12 months notice to quit.
Yeah, but
Now,
if
they might
want
also,
if they want to get out earlier, they're being penalised. So I think it's giving students a piece of legislation that allows them, to have that breakout clause is something that would be a massive improvement.
Yeah, because on that, so some students who take up a house in September have to keep it right across the summer period, even though term time has ended, and that's an expense. There is another aspect to this, and I suppose I worded my question wrong when I said students. There are people who, for instance, work in hospitals who have been seconded to gain experience. So you'll find that rented properties around hospital sites are tweaked, and there's a difference there. Also, teaching staff that maybe are seconded or maybe are taking up temporary roles whilst people are off long-term sick or even maternity, that can have an impact on rented sector properties in an area, especially larger schools. So whilst it's minute and small, that does occur. Have you any thoughts on that scenario, those scenarios?
I think you're right. I think one of the things which came up in consultation was a question around why we were treating tenancies of shorter tenancies of less than 12 months slightly differently. And I think you've just outlined a series of reasons why there are some people who need a flexible short-term tenancy, and some landlords are willing to do that. And we wouldn't want to overly constrain that, because it is important for those people who need it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to answer a slightly different question, which is, why did we split this into three? Why did we say up to 12 months from 1 year to 9 years, and then, 1 year to 10 years, and then 10 years and above? It was those sorts of flexible arrangements, those sort of shorter, flexible type arrangements that we didn't want to basically regulate out of existence.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments then on clause 11 at this stage? No doubt we'll have a wee bit of a chat about this after the meeting or on Thursday. All right, can we move on then? All right, we're going to move on then to clauses 12, 13 and 14. So if, I suppose you could we'll just put those together if that's okay. 12, 13 and 14 for a brief.
Karen, do you want it? We didn't think we'd get this far, so we hadn't arranged who would say this. Karen, have you got it there?
Yeah, 12. So 12's interpretation. This defines the department responsible for the bill and attracts the definitions used in the 2006 order. 13 is commencement. This provides the Act comes into operation on the day after the day it receives royal assent, and there's a wee bit probably different about that. Clause 14, short title. This cites the bill as the Private Tenancies Northern Ireland Bill.
Well done, thank you. All right, so then in the views in clause 12 that we had included, given the urgency of which all stakeholders agree these reforms are necessary, it might be helpful to include a time limit in this clause similar to Article 72.4 of the 2006 order. Also, this does not give a clear picture of what is being changed from and what to, and amendments are needed to ensure the Department for Communities commences clauses by a specific date. On clause 13 there were no comments, and on clause 14 there were no comments either. So just if I don't know if you have anything prepared there or not, Karen, but on what was on the concerns that were raised just on clause 12, anything to comment on?
I'm just reading the urgency was
So I suppose on commencement, so there's a couple of times people raised commencement, and obviously some people want things to start as quickly as possible. Now we've gone through what's involved with the committee, you'll see that there's certain cases where we do need to carry out consultation first before we can commence, especially with councils who are going to enforce it, but also to be fair to landlords, to give them time, and letting agents to inform them of what their new duties are, and tenants as well. We'd want to consult with tenants and tenants representatives and make sure people like Housing Rights Service are, fully aware of what the changes are. Other things are going to take more work. So whilst we're commencing things, what we're commencing is the power for us to do regulations. And then we'll want to, like the electrical safety and things like that. I mean, we had a good discussion there about the importance of getting that right. making sure everything's properly defined and filling out all the detail in consultation with the people who know about these things. So that's why whereas we might be giving ourselves the power to commence the powers early, those will be powers to make regulations.
Okay, look, thank you. Kelly, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, right. I just wanted to ask, it's about that commencement side of things and the discussion with district councils. So bear with me, this is bigger picture stuff. So at the minute we have departments are doing budget planning for the next 3 years. My concern is that if we miss this window where there has to be, no, I don't disagree that there needs to be consultation with district councils, absolutely they should be, but my concern is that we miss the window for the budget so that the consultation happens with the district councils of the responsibilities that they will have to take on. There will be a certain level of funding that they will require in order to deliver those actions, but we've missed the window, that envelope of funding for them to be included. I'm just very concerned that we're not running at the right parallel times with the budget and with this piece of work. So is there any concerns, or what's the department planning to do to allocate budget, sort of anticipating budget for councils in order that they can deliver what they will be required to once this commences for them?
I suppose it would be remiss of me not to say that under the Private Tenancies Order, where there are duties been placed on councils and not powers, they don't get any funding directly from the department to carry out the functions that they have under the Private Tenancies Order. What has been established has been a project group to look at the transfer of responsibility for the landlord registration scheme and the fee that the registration scheme attracts to transfer over to councils as a bigger piece of work, which would then give them a funding stream that would enable them to do a lot of the work around inspections of properties and enforcement of some of the responsibilities they already have. That project group was established, I think, the week before we went into the first lockdown, and we've held several meetings and commissioned some work to see what that could look like, what the legislation around that would look like. But the view is that we have to do something whereby the council, who are at the front end of all of this and who have big responsibilities in relation to all of this, are properly funded to do the work that's required to make the private rented sector a better place for tenants and indeed for landlords. So when it comes to budget planning, I'm not sure that David could maybe elaborate a bit more on the budget planning, but I'm looking at this purely from Housing Division, what we do around private tenancies. We don't give them any money, and it's a constant conversation that we have with our colleagues in the councils around the powers that they have but no duties, and the lack of funding and the strain that a lot of this can place on their resources, which is why we're looking at the registration scheme, the fee, and how that can be best used, and to try to tie everything up together.
Kelly, that's actually a brilliant question, because it allows us to talk about a really important thing which will actually enable all of this. But the short answer, as Ailey said, is we don't directly fund the councils. They pay for it all of this out of their own resources, and that's not just the things in this amendment bill. That's everything already in the private tenancies, order, and there is a consistent message coming back to us that councils don't feel properly resourced to protect tenants in their local areas, in line with the expectations of the legislation that has been in place for quite a long time. So, as you know, we have a landlord registration scheme. Landlords pay to register. That's currently being run by the department, so that money's coming to us. But that leaves us a position where we have the resources, but councils have the powers. So we want to fix this. Now, part of our next phase, notwithstanding the fact that we've already started discussions with councils about how we might do this, but we are planning to move the landlord registrar to councils.
With their agreement, David, we'll have to qualify that.
With their agreement. So our ambition, I don't know how I want to
yes, our ambition is probably a better way to phrase it.
And that would give... ask on that, for instance, so you know at the minute, as the department, the number of landlords, how much money's coming in from the register. So I'm going to ask a clarification question then. So we get to commencement and this falls to the councils. So the landlord's based in Belfast, but for instance, they may well have private tenancies that are in my constituency of Strangford. So where does that registry money go to? Does it go to Belfast City Council, or does it go to Ards and North Down or Newry Morning South Down? And on top of that, we are all very aware councils have been given money in the past, for instance, from the Department of Infrastructure to clean streets and do things like that. They're under the litter registration or under the litter legislation. They have the powers to clean roads and don't do that. So if we don't give them money to do this, how can we possibly stand over the fact that they are going to do this for tenants? Because if they say they don't have the budget, it's like many departments will say to me quite often, we don't have the money to do that, Kelly, so we can't do it. I'm just concerned that unless there is, even in the early days, a commitment to fund, and then it moves over to the landlord's register, creating that. So it's just the clarification on that, because we may go to commencement and it'll make no difference. It'll be a piece of paper that means nothing for tenants.
Yeah, I suppose the landlord, and I'm going to let David answer the bigger question around budgets and budget allocation. At the minute, there's the legislation around the landlord registration fee is very clear as to what that fee can be used for, and it is only for the promotion of the landlord registration scheme. So the money comes into the department as a central pot. We don't allocate it up. We don't look to see where the landlords live. It comes into a central pot and it's used for the administration of the fee. If we are at the point in time that I hope we can get to where the budget is being allocated, that's when we'll be having the conversations with councils. And they're the sorts of conversations that we have started off with councils around, well, what should the fee be? How frequently should registration be? What does the legislation need to be changed to reflect that the money can be used for inspections, for a planned programme of inspections? And then where would responsibility be for a property? Is it in the council area where the property is, or is it the landlord and where the landlord's home address is? So those are the conversations that are taking place, and there was a research piece that is informing further conversations around that was undertaken just at the start of the first lockdown. Sorry, David, the other broader thing about funding, I'm passing very happily over to you.
I was going to make those points.
Okay.
The money from the landlord registration fee has to be used for the purposes for the running of the register. So when we look at that, whilst resources will be made available to councils if we use this model, which we're talking to councils about, it'll only be able to be used for certain purposes. So if it won't be generally made available in like any sort of block grant that they can then decide whether or not to use it for that purpose or not, it'll be specific to that. They also would have duties associated with that transfer of responsibility. So the model more would be along the lines of the HMOs. Now, what was decided to do there was that certain councils would do it on behalf of other ones as well. So it's mainly run out of Belfast with an office up on the north coast. Because of where HMOs are. So there's different, when we're saying we're discussing with councils, there's different models that they may want to do on this. But in the HMO one, there's a licence fee paid by the people who operate the HMOs, it's paid by Belfast City Council, and the council use that money to fund the checks and things like that they do. We think that model works quite well.
I would just be saying that HMOs are unique to particular areas in Northern Ireland. There aren't so many in Strangford, I have to admit, but what we do have in Strangford is mileage, and I would be wondering if there would be rural proofing built into that to ensure that those rural areas don't have private tenancies out in the middle of nowhere. But given that discussion, I'm just wondering under commencement then, would it not be better to put a time scale on this, so that tenants will know who they can turn to, who they can go to if they have issues about their landlord, who landlords know that they're responsible to, because otherwise this drags on a bit. Should we be saying section whatever will come into, or the day, or what is it, when it receives royal assent plus 6 months or plus 12 months, should there be a date on that? Just to keep...
I appreciate what you're saying, and I think in an ideal world we would love to be in a position to do that, but what we don't want to do, I suppose, is put in a commencement date and then the work that we're doing proves to be complex. There's a lot of consultation, and then it looks like we have to rush something in order to meet a commencement date. I think it's better we're keen to get this commenced as soon as we possibly can. We've been working on this for some time. It was stalled for a number of years. We are really, really keen to get this in as quickly as we possibly can, and we give that assurance to committee. But sometimes the commencement dates, if you put something like that in, it can drive out perverse behaviours, in that we rush to do things and maybe don't do them as well or to the detail that we would ideally like to do them if we're trying to meet some sort of a deadline like that.
I'm just thinking...
Some of them would...
Sorry, David, go on ahead.
So I was going to say that, just to add to that, because I know I'm going to sound very much like a civil servant, but you would be worried about just making a number up and then us having to rush to meet that and doing something wrong. I mean, we want to get this right. Some of the things are going to take a lot more consideration. In the energy efficiency, we need to go out to a full consultation. We need to spend a lot of time talking to the Department for Economy, Green Growth Strategy and things like that. You know, even the trajectory that we don't know yet about the climate change bill would change what we might want to do with the energy efficiency parts of this. But other bits would be possibly more straightforward and could be done quicker.
I think just my concern would be on the commencement when it comes into councils. If we're giving them, obviously the consultation will take place, so hopefully whatever is coming forward they have agreed to. But if they get a commencement date where they take responsibility in a mid financial year, then they won't have the money to actually take that forward until the following April. So I'm just very aware of that timing as well on that, but I'm sure you guys are going to take that. And I would love to see a date on this just to move things forward. I know that there's a bit more work has to be done in the consultation on clause, where are we at? The clause 11 with regards to the requirements for notice. But I think that this is a piece of legislation that so many tenants are looking forward to. It would be lovely if as much as possible could have a date on it so that tenants know who they can go to, when they will finally get their receipts, you know, when will all of that stuff happen on. And there's some of this is coming in with regards to Royal Assent, but there's quite a bit left behind. It's just with going in, I suppose, to a future minister to bring this in as well. It would be nice to have even 12 months put on some of this stuff, but I appreciate where you're coming from. All I would say, having been a councillor and knowing how their budget process works, I'll say please work with them on when their budgets are set, because if we give them something mid-year, they're not going to be able to take this up.
Yeah, and I think that is something that is actually really good in a committee when you do have councillors who have been there. I mean, I was a councillor for 7 years before I was an MLA, and I was always very mindful of that. And I think that is why in almost everything that the department hand to councils, the first question I ask is who's paying for it, because I know what it's like to be a councillor and receive powers from this assembly, and the money doesn't follow through, and that happens more often than what we would like. And I remember that whenever I was part of the HMO under DSD committee, and about the finances around that and that following through. So I very much agree with Kelly on this, that whenever we're looking at powers to councils, it must be funded, most definitely. Because we also have lots of our colleagues that sit in those councils, so yeah, we get the barrage of questions around that too. Look, we have lost our quorum now. Aisling and Anya left at 10:30. They obviously had stuff to do in the chamber, and Andy has just left, so we can't make any more decisions. But there's just a little final part, and I think we can go through it anyway, because it's just to highlight a few issues that also came up. In relation to offences and penalties created by the bills. So they were that clear guidance is issued to local councils on how and when enforcement powers should be used. The penalties should be spelled out clearly and should be high enough to be a genuine deterrent. And offences and penalties seem to relate to the landlord. Should also be penalties for tenants offences. And it would be helpful if there was a way to find out if a landlord has previous convictions on these offences. So I'm not going to ask, I think that is something that we can leave with yourselves for further comment on that, if you want to get back to us on any of those queries or questions. Members, anything else? Again, I'm quite conscious we don't have a quorum to make any decisions or to ask for further, or to ask the minister to go and do whatever we need to do, or the department, because we don't have a quorum. But any further comments before we wrap this session up?
Could
Paul,
I maybe just
sorry,
go
Mark, go
way
ahead.
back the clause
Mark.
1?
Right, Mark wants to go back to clause 1.
No,
We're
it's
going to
just- it's
start
just-
from the beginning again.
No.
Always living in the past.
It's just
Right, remember this is hand-sorted with what you say here. Right, go ahead,
Nothing.
Mark.
No, it's in terms of the need for the department to publish the guidance and links to supporting materials for landlords and tenants. Do we know what that guidance is yet? And obviously the guidance, the exact detail of it will be dependent on the outcome of the bill. But I was thinking in terms of, like, all our focus has been on rent, which is natural enough because that's the transaction between the tenant and the landlord. But the issue with rates and universal credit, how it was taken out of housing benefit, I've seen in the past, in the not too distant past, how that can prove equally difficult, or well, difficult for landlords initially, but ultimately then for tenants who maybe were working on the assumption that the universal credit, their housing benefit element, was covering rent or rates, which it doesn't. There's a separate process to apply for that sort of assistance.
Yeah, so the guidance is, the guidance could usefully cover that, to make sure everyone knows what's going on. We talked earlier about a model tenancy agreement and producing something like that, which would set out other things other than, the real basis, the basics of it, which would, you have to consider there's different steps to this. So there's things that we would want to say absolutely have to be in it, and some of those are blindingly obvious, like who is the landlord, but that is not always that obvious, to be honest. Whereas the tenancy, exactly what are they renting, what is the extent of it, the dates and things like that, and what the rent is and when it should be paid. And so those are the sorts of things that we might make mandatory. But then there's another set of things. So we talked about, electrical safety and things like that. But things like the guidance, I think, it would be really useful to put things in about rates, because things like that are becoming more complicated. It's not always part of the rent. The rates is not always part of the rent. It's only mandatory to make that arrangement up to a certain level. Now, it is customarily carried out for all tenancies in Northern Ireland, but it might not be. So things like that do need to be clear.
Yeah, I know it's caused difficulty for even letting agents, people that this is their bread and butter, but it's caused them problems as well.
It has been. We did try to communicate the message out through our landlord newsletter to let landlords know that they could let their tenants know, and through the tenants deposit scheme administrators, that they had to make a separate application to claim for their rates payments, that it wasn't included, in their housing costs, and it has caused people real difficulties. Absolutely.
All right, okay, thank you to yourselves for joining us today. And really good that we got that wrapped up. Can I just ask then, will you be able to furnish us for this Thursday with some of the with responses to queries that were raised last Thursday?
We're working on it at the moment, and we hope to be able to come back to you with anything that we can. Chair, yes.
As we were going to ask you to rather have last Thursdays as quick as possible rather than them all together.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Just whenever you have them, fire them through to us. That would be great. Whatever you have for this Thursday, whether it's all or not, but if you could get it through to us, because it just helps us then, even when we will have probably a bit of a closed session on Thursday with Claire, so that'll help us with that.
Yeah.
But that's grand.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, folks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
All right, members,
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to move on to agenda item 4, which is date, time and location of our next meeting. Our next meeting will take place this Thursday, the 2nd of December 2021 in room 29 at 9 a.m. Thank you.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.